30 feet beneath a public park in Egypt, there is a wall that should not exist. It runs arrow straight through the bedrock. Cut stone blocks, each one heavier than a car, set in place by people who spoke Greek and worked before Rome ruled anything. The team following that wall has traced 200 feet of it and still has not reached the end of it. It is on no map. It appears in no record. Above it sit 5 million people, a grid of modern streets, and 20 centuries of rubble. And here is why that wall matters more than anything else found in this city in 100 years. The ancient writers left exactly one instruction for locating the most valuable missing object in all of archaeology. They said it stood inside the royal enclosure north of the crossroads where the two great avenues met. That crossroads was surveyed once, a long time ago, and then swallowed by the modern city. Line that old survey up against a satellite image of Alexandria today, and the royal enclosure lands in one place. It lands on that park. It lands on that wall. People have been hunting the tomb of Alexander the Great for more than 1,600 years. There have been over 140 recognized searches. Napoleon wanted it. Heinrich Schliemann, the man who dug up Troy, wanted it. Howard Carter, who opened the tomb of Tutankhamun, was pulled toward it. Every one of them failed, and most of them failed for the same reason. They were digging in the wrong century of the city. The archaeologist working that park is not guessing. She has the street grid, she has the layers, she has the foundations of a monumental Greek building that no one knew was down there. And in the sidewall of one of her trenches, 20 feet below the surface, in wet gray mud, she pulled out something that stopped the world for a week. First a knee, then a leg, then a second leg, then the body. And then a face she recognized instantly, because it is one of the most copied faces in human history. That is the payoff, and it is confirmed. Now here is what sits underneath it. There is a hand-cut tunnel down there that runs 25 feet and then stops against a wall of rubble covered in scorch marks and fragments of burnt rope. There is a scan of that park that found 14 buried anomalies under the grass, and only one of them has ever been opened. There is a stone box sitting in a museum in London right now that a serious historian argues held Alexander's body first. And there is a question that has quietly shadowed this entire search from the beginning. Not where the tomb is, whether the body is even still in Egypt. Start with the thing almost everyone gets wrong. Alexander's tomb was never hidden. That is the part that breaks people. It was not a secret chamber cut into a desert cliff. It was a public monument standing at a crossroads in the richest city on earth, open to visitors, with a body inside that you could walk up and look at with your own eyes. Julius Caesar went to see it, Augustus went to see it, and according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, he touched the face and broke off a piece of the nose. Caligula took a breastplate out of it and wore it. Caracalla left his own cloak, his rings, and his belt behind as offerings. For roughly 300 years, this was the single most famous address in the ancient world. Emperors organized state visits around it, and then it was gone. Erased so completely that within 2 centuries, a preacher writing in that same region could ask where Alexander's tomb was and answer his own question by saying that not even Alexander's own people knew. A landmark that size does not evaporate. Something happened to it, and something happened to the body inside it. Follow that trail step by step, and you end up standing in a public garden in Alexandria, watching a woman fight groundwater for 2 decades to reach the one layer where the answer has to be. Here is the first clue, and it is the one you can see with your own eyes. Alexandria is one of the hardest cities on Earth to excavate. It covers more than 100 square miles, roughly 5 times the footprint of Manhattan, and every square foot of the ancient Greek city sits underneath a living one. You cannot trench a highway. You cannot lift an apartment block. Worse, the ancient ground level now sits below the water table, so any hole you dig starts filling within hours, which is exactly why Shallalat Gardens matters. It is a public park in the heart of the Old City, about 1 million square feet, roughly 17 football fields, and almost nobody had ever explored it properly. In 2007, a Greek archaeologist named Calliope Limneos Papakosta got permission to dig there. She had already been working in Alexandria since 2000, and she had spent years reading the ancient sources the way you would read a set of directions rather than a set of legends. Her team has removed something like 20,000 tons of earth, almost twice the weight of the Eiffel Tower, lifted out of a park by hand and bucket. To hold the water back, they run 16 pumps across 8 wells around the clock. When a pipe breaks, the site floods to nearly 10 feet within 2 hours, and weeks of work vanish. For 14 years, she found nothing that mattered. Then, in May 2009, on the last day of a dig season, with the equipment being packed and the season written off, a bit of soil shifted in the pit. An assistant called her over to look at a fleck of white marble in the trench wall. She has said she was praying it was more than a fragment. It was more than a fragment. 20 feet down, in the mud, was an early Hellenistic statue with every hallmark of Alexander the Great, carved in the tradition of Lysippus, the only sculptor Alexander allowed to portray him. The head tilted, turned slightly down and to the side, the exact pose the ancient writers describe. The president of Greece came to the dig site. The statue stands restored today in the Alexandria National Museum. And that would have been the whole story, except the statue was never the point. What mattered was what it proved. She had reached the Greek lair of Alexandria. She was standing on ground that was walked on while the city was still new. So, she kept going down. Below the modern lair, then the Byzantine, then the Roman, her team started pulling out amphora handles from the big clay jars used to ship wine in from Rhodes, each one stamped with the maker's name and the date. Greek names in clay, buried under an Egyptian city, then painted plaster in deep blue and red. That blue is calcium copper silicate, the world's first artificial pigment, and the same decorative scheme used in the Royal Macedonian tombs back in Greece. Then, white Aegean marble, which is remarkable on its own because there is no natural stone in the Nile Delta. Every piece was shipped in, and then, at the bottom, the black stones. Roman roads in this region were paved in black stone, and Roman engineers almost always rebuilt directly on top of the older Greek streets. Her team uncovered about 25 meters of that paving. A road, still in place, 30 feet under a public park. Now here is where a 200-year-old document turns into a targeting system. In 1866, an Egyptian astronomer named Mahmud Bey al-Falaki surveyed Alexandria at a moment when parts of the ancient street grid were still visible on the surface. He mapped it. He recorded the 2 great avenues of the classical city, the Canopic Way, running east to west, nearly 100 feet across, and a second great street running north to south, crossing it. Then the city grew over everything, and his map became a curiosity in an archive. Papakosta had a transparency made of that 1866 map and laid it over a satellite image of modern Alexandria, aligning them using the one feature that has not moved, the coastline. The result is the reason this investigation exists. The crossroads of the 2 great avenues sits within a few feet of Shallalat Gardens, and the road her team uncovered, the one they call L2, lines up as the first parallel street north of the Canopic Way. Which brings us to Strabo. The Greek geographer visited Alexandria in the 1st century before Christ, while the tomb was still standing and still open to visitors. He wrote down where it was, not in riddles, in plain geography. He placed it inside the enclosure of the royal quarter, and he placed the royal quarter north of the central crossroads. North of the crossroads is Shallalat Gardens. North of the crossroads is her road. North of the crossroads is that 200-foot foundation wall. She is not hunting for the royal quarter anymore. she is standing in it. And that changes what the ground under that park actually is. Because the royal quarter was not only palaces, the library, and the museum. Not one of them has ever been found. Not a single Ptolemaic royal tomb. 10 generations of pharaohs, one of the wealthiest dynasties in the ancient world, and their entire cemetery is still missing under a modern city. If you want to see how far down this goes, subscribe now, because the next part of the investigation is where the written record stops cooperating. Because to know what she is actually looking for, you have to know what happened to the body. And the ancient accounts of that read like fantasy until you translate them into physical processes. Alexander was gone at 32 in Babylon in June of 323 before Christ, after 12 days of fever. Plutarch records that the body lay unattended in a hot room for 6 days while the generals argued over the succession, and that it showed no sign of decay. The ancient writers took this as proof of divinity. Modern scholars called it propaganda. Then, in 2018, Dr. Catherine Hall of the University of Otago in New Zealand published a different reading. She argued the symptoms in the sources: a paralysis moving upward through the body, a clear mind, a fever, match a neurological condition we now call Guillain-Barré syndrome. In its severe form, it slows breathing until it is nearly invisible and makes the pulse extremely hard to detect. Read it that way, and the 6 days without decay is not a miracle at all. It is an observation recorded accurately by people who did not have the vocabulary to explain it, which raises a genuinely unsettling possibility about the exact moment he was declared gone, and about a body that may have been prepared for burial while it was doing something the ancient world had no word for. For decades, scholars dismissed the whole passage as symbolic. It reads very differently as a medical record. The same thing happens with the preservation. Egyptian embalmers were brought in. The Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus tells us the body was treated in the Egyptian manner, and several ancient writers report that it was then placed in honey. That sounds like myth. It is chemistry. Honey has extremely low water activity. It is acidic, and it generates hydrogen peroxide, which makes it one of the most effective natural preservatives known. It is still used in wound dressings in modern hospitals. A body sealed in honey does not decay. It is precisely how you keep a king presentable for public viewing in a hot climate for 500 years, which is exactly how long he was on display. They were not writing poetry. They were writing a preservation protocol. Then comes the strangest part. Diodorus describes the vehicle built to carry the body home. 2 years to construct. A gold sarcophagus, a vaulted chamber plated in gold, ionic columns, a roof of golden scales set with jewels, wheels engineered for an enormous load, and road crews sent ahead to level the route in advance. That is not a funeral. That is a logistics operation. And it was hijacked. In 321 before Christ, Ptolemy intercepted the convoy in Syria and took the body to Egypt by force, not out of grief. Alexander's body was the single most powerful political object on the planet. Whoever held the founder held the legitimacy. Ptolemy took it to Memphis first, and later it was moved into Alexandria, into the enclosure Strabo describes. There it stayed, on public display, for half a millennium. Later, a Ptolemaic king who ran short of money stripped the gold sarcophagus and melted it into coin, replacing it with one of glass or crystal, so the body could still be seen. That is why Augustus was able to stand over the face and reach out and touch it. So the record is not vague. We know he was in the city. We know the container. We know emperors were still walking in to look at him 400 years later. And then, in the space of about 200 years, all of it disappears. Here is where it gets strange. Around the year 200, the Emperor Septimius Severus came to Alexandria. He was fascinated by the occult and by anything hidden. According to Cassius Dio, Severus collected secret books from the sanctuaries of Egypt, had them placed inside Alexander's tomb, and then had the tomb closed off, so that from then on, no one could see the body and no one could read what he had put in there. That is the moment the lights go out. Not a natural collapse, not looting, an imperial order. 15 years later, Caracalla visited and left his offerings. That is the last credible eyewitness account anyone has ever found. After that, nothing. No visitor descriptions, no repair records, no complaints. A monument that emperors crossed the sea to visit simply stops being mentioned. Then the city itself starts coming apart. There were riots and fires, and on the 21st of July, in the year 365, an enormous earthquake off Crete sent a wave into Alexandria. The Roman soldier and historian Ammianus Marcellinus described the sea drawing back to expose the seabed, then returning and throwing ships onto the roofs of houses. Thousands were lost in a single morning. Alexandria never recovered its old center. Ground subsidence dropped part of the ancient waterfront, including a piece of the royal district, straight into the harbor, where the underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio has spent years mapping palace platforms and a vanished island under the shipping lanes. By about the year 400, Alexander was already an unanswerable question in his own city. It was sealed, it was drowned, and then it was forgotten. Which is why every serious search since has hit the same wall, and why the ones that got close have a habit of ending badly. In 1995, a Greek archaeologist working at the Siwa Oasis, deep in the Western Desert, announced she had found the tomb. Siwa is where Alexander was declared the son of a god, and ancient sources claim he asked to be buried there. She reported a large structure, Greek inscriptions, Macedonian symbols. The announcement went around the world. Within months, it collapsed. The Greek Ministry of Culture publicly rejected the identification. Her permit was pulled, the dig was shut down, and she has spent the years since arguing that she was blocked rather than disproved. Whatever you make of the claim, the shutdown is a matter of public record. Then, in 2018, construction workers in the Sidi Gaber district of Alexandria hit something 5 meters down. A black granite sarcophagus, nearly 9 feet long, sealed with mortar, untouched for around 2,000 years. Within a day, the internet had decided it was Alexander. Authorities opened it under guard and found 3 skeletons and a pool of water that had seeped in through a crack. It was not him. But look at what that story tells you. A sealed Ptolemaic sarcophagus was sitting under an ordinary residential street, and nobody knew until a crew put a shovel through it. That is how close this layer of history sits to daily life in Alexandria, and how easily it can be destroyed by accident. Which brings the investigation back to the park and to the technology. With support from National Geographic, a Greek geophysical team ran a survey across Shallalat Gardens using electrical resistivity tomography. Cables are laid across the grass, and current is passed deep into the ground. Hundreds of readings are plotted into digital maps showing the density of everything below. Loose sand reads one way, solid stone reads another. The outline of a buried building, a chamber, or a void shows up as an anomaly. The survey found 14. It was quarried about 30 miles outside the city and shipped in specifically to build Alexandria. They were looking at pieces of the original city from a hole in the ground through a camera built for jet engines. So they dug 400 tons of soil, 25 feet down, with December storms flooding the trench under 4 feet of water and walls fragile enough to collapse. They kept going and reached the natural sandstone bedrock of Alexandria. And there was human cutting in it. Deliberate, engineered, unmistakable. But it was not a chamber. It was a ditch. A defensive moat dug for the medieval walls of the city, roughly 1,000 years after Alexander. In that entire section of the park, the Greek and Ptolemaic layer is simply not there anymore. Later inhabitants scraped it away and reshaped the ground for their own walls. That is a brutal result, and it matters because it proves the royal quarter was not preserved intact like a time capsule. Parts of it were quarried, cut through, and recycled. Whatever survives down there survives in patches. And then, back at the main trench, her team found the thing nobody has been able to explain. They uncovered a construction with a hollow inside it. A tunnel, man-made, cut by hand, running off into the dark under hundreds of tons of earth, with only a shallow pocket of breathable air at the top. Volunteers went in. They got about 25 feet before the passage stopped, blocked floor to ceiling with rubble, and on that rubble, scorch marks. Mixed into it, fragments of burnt rope. Somebody filled that tunnel in. Somebody used fire to do it. And it has been sitting sealed like that for centuries. It has not been cleared, and it cannot be cleared safely because above that passage sit tons of unstable soil, a public street, and a modern building. So, the tunnel stays shut, and whatever is on the other side of it stays where it is. Now here is the reveal that turns this whole search into a much harder problem. Because there is a serious argument that what she is looking for left Egypt a very long time ago. In 1798, Napoleon's expedition found something extraordinary in a mosque in Alexandria. A sarcophagus of hard, dark stone, carved over every surface with hieroglyphs, being used as a ritual washing basin, with a dozen holes drilled through it to drain the water. The French scholars compared it against the ancient descriptions of Alexander's burial and concluded they had found him. 3 years later, British forces took Alexandria and shipped the box to London as a prize. It went on display as the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great. It is still in the British Museum today. Then, in the 1820s, the hieroglyphs were finally read, and the cartouche gave a completely different name. Nectanebo II, the last native-born pharaoh of Egypt, who fled south when the Persian army arrived and never used the sarcophagus he had commissioned. Case closed. The label was changed, and the box became a footnote for nearly 2 centuries. Alexander arrived in Egypt as a body with no burial container, because his original gold one had already been stripped or was still being argued over. And sitting unused in Memphis, the exact city where Ptolemy first took the body, was a finished, empty, royal-grade sarcophagus belonging to the pharaoh whose son Alexander was publicly claimed to be. Then that same box turns up centuries later in Alexandria, in the district where the tomb is believed to have stood, inside a mosque built over the foundations of an older church. Not a similar box, not a copy, that box. And if the container traveled, the argument goes, so could the contents. In the year 828, 2 Venetian merchants removed a body from Alexandria and shipped it back to Venice, claiming it was the remains of the evangelist Mark. The story, preserved in Venice, says they packed it under pork so that inspectors at the port would refuse to search the cargo. Those relics are still in Venice, beneath the high altar of the basilica built to house them. Chugg's argument is that the Church of Mark in Alexandria stood in the same district as Alexander's monument, that the Greek word for Alexander's tomb becomes the name attached to that Christian relic with the change of a single letter, and that a Christian community in a city under new rule had every reason to relabel a pagan king as a saint, rather than let him be destroyed. He has also identified a carved block in the crypt of the basilica in Venice that he argues carries the design of a Macedonian shield. Those relics have never been scientifically examined. No dating, no analysis. They sit under an altar in Italy. That is a theory, not a finding. But the theory only exists because the tomb is missing, and it can only be settled from one direction, which is the ground under that park. So now the hard question. Does any of this prove that Alexander is lying intact beneath a public garden in Alexandria, waiting for someone to lift a slab? Probably not. And the honest version of this investigation has to say why. The ancient layer sits 30 feet down below the water table. Any chamber down there has most likely been flooded for centuries, and that environment destroys wood, fabric, and organic remains. The city was also quarried relentlessly. E3b proved it, with the entire Greek layer scraped out and replaced by a medieval ditch. Whatever survives is fragmented. The written sources are late and secondhand. Strabo is the best we have, and he wrote 3 centuries after the burial. That is not a small number to bet against. But here is the thing. Even the most conservative reading of what Papakosta has done is extraordinary. She has excavated deeper in this part of Alexandria than anyone in the modern era. She reached the bedrock the original city was founded on, and the first streets ever laid in it. She found the foundations of a monumental Ptolemaic building that appears in no record, over 200 feet long and still running. She correlated those foundations with a road system that was mapped in 1866 and then lost to history. And she confirmed the location of the royal quarter, which had never been physically identified, only argued about. Inside that quarter, according to the sources, lies a royal cemetery holding 10 generations of Ptolemaic rulers. Not one has ever been found. That is an entire valley of the kings, unopened, under a living city. Even if Alexander himself is gone, that cemetery is not. Finding it would be the largest Greek discovery since 1977, when Manolis Andronikos opened an undisturbed chamber at Vergina in northern Greece and found a golden box, wreaths of solid gold, and armor fit for a king. Archaeologists are still arguing about whether the man inside was Alexander's father. That one tomb rewrote what we thought Macedonian royalty looked like. Alexandria is holding 10 generations of them. It would hold the offerings left by Roman emperors. It may still hold the sealed books Severus put inside before he closed the door, texts described as secret that have never been recovered, in a chamber that was shut and then dropped out of history within 200 years. If that seal held, they are still in there. And there is one question nobody has answered. Somebody went into that tunnel under the park. Somebody filled it with rubble, used fire while they did it, and left the burnt rope behind. That took effort. That took a decision. The question is not what they were hiding from. It is what they were hiding. The gardens are still open. Families walk across them every afternoon. 13 of the 14 anomalies have never been touched. The tunnel is still blocked, and there are no plans to clear it. The pumps still run 24 hours a day, because the moment they stop, the water comes back and the whole site becomes a lake again. And 30 feet down, in the dark, that wall keeps running past 200 feet towards something no one has seen in 2,000 years. Still buried, still sealed, still waiting for somebody to reach the end of it. The next investigation is on screen now.